Welcome to Uncle Das Financial Intelligence Diary, a financial growth channel that hopes everyone can become rich. The book we will read today is Being in the Room. Author Lan Xiaohuan holds a PhD in economics from the University of Virginia. Currently a professor of economics at CEIBS. His research focuses on development economics, political economics, and other fields, deeply cultivating the integration of local government investment and financing with economic transformation. This book has now been translated into multiple languages. It is one of the most representative books for interpreting China's economy. Due to the platform's review mechanism in the subsequent interpretation, I can only use the word Dongda to represent our country. This is not meant to be offensive, and I hope for your understanding. Okay, without further ado, let's begin. Economic puzzles in life. The answers are often hidden in the logic of government behavior. Want to know why housing prices become more and more scrutinized with each regulation? Why do various places compete to offer preferential policies when attracting investment? Should we worry about the risks of local government debt? These issues, closely related to our wealth and employment, are never purely the result of spontaneous market operations. The government has never been outside the room. Instead, it deeply participates in the production and distribution of the cake. It is the key to understanding Dongda's economy. Many people feel a disconnect when reading economic news, thinking policy documents are dry and difficult to understand. The root cause is not grasping the logic of government operations. The most valuable aspect of this book is that it moves beyond the abstract debate of government vs. market. It neither praises nor criticizes, but pragmatically dissects how the government operates and why it does so. It doesn't teach empty theories, but only real operating mechanisms, how local governments balance revenue and expenditure, how land and finance are linked, how official incentives affect investment. Understanding these, you can discern the essence from the bustling news and grasp opportunities from complex policies. More importantly, understanding Dongda's economy cannot be done by applying Western theoretical templates. Our government is both a provider of public services and a participant in economic development. This dual role is determined by history and reality. If you approach it with the preconceived notion that the government should withdraw from the market, you will easily misunderstand reality. Only with sympathetic understanding can you see the choices the government makes under resource constraints, and truly understand the past and future of Dongda's economy. And to understand the government, the core is to first grasp its micro-operational foundation. How power is divided, how fiscal and tax revenues are distributed, how incentives are designed. This is precisely what we will delve into next. Starting with the core affairs of local governments, we will gradually unveil the underlying code of Dongda's economic operations. If Dongda's economy is a high-speed giant ship, local governments are the core power units of this ship. The core logic of the first part of Being in the Room is that local governments are by no means mere administrators, but participants and drivers deeply involved in the economic cycle. From power division to fiscal revenue and expenditure, from investment and financing operations to industrial support, every step revolves around the core goal of developing the economy. Understanding this micro-operational mechanism allows us to comprehend the underlying code of Dongda's economic growth, and also understand the root causes of the macro phenomena in the next part. Local governments can manage the economy well, primarily due to their unique power structure and division of affairs. It is neither a one-size-fits-all centralized model, nor a completely decentralized model, but a dynamic balance of layered linkage and territorial management. To understand the behavior of local governments, we must first grasp their organizational framework. First, there is the five-tier government system: central, provincial, municipal, county, and township. While seemingly distinct in hierarchy, in actual operation it is full of flexibility. For example, for the same prefecture-level city, a provincial capital has far greater resource allocation power than an ordinary prefecture-level city. Similarly, for county-level units, county-level cities have more power in land and economic affairs than counties. Secondly, there is the division of vertical and horizontal responsibilities and multiple leadership. Departments managed vertically, such as the Ministry of Finance, Provincial Finance Department, Municipal Finance Bureau. Horizontally, its administrative divisions. For example, provinces, cities, counties. Most local departments have to report to two lines: In terms of operations, they follow the guidance of superior departments. In terms of personnel and resources, they report to local government leaders. This dual leadership allows local governments to align with superior policies and flexibly adapt to local needs. Then there's the core principle of central-local relations. Under the unified leadership of the central government, fully leverage the initiative and enthusiasm of local areas. This principle, though seemingly abstract, permeates all economic activities. For example, the central government sets the tone for high-quality development. Localities will then adjust their investment promotion standards. The central government emphasizes preventing debt risks. Localities will tighten lending to financing platforms. What local governments should and should not manage is not decided arbitrarily but follows three core logics. These are also the underlying principles of their economic behavior. The first is the externality principle. Matters affecting only the locality are decided locally. Cross-regional matters are coordinated by superiors. For example, building a local primary school can be decided by the city. But factory pollution affecting neighboring cities requires provincial intervention. Pollution control across provincial rivers requires central coordination. The second is the information principle. Whoever understands the situation best makes the decision. For example, township governments best understand the needs of local rural medical insurance, so they are responsible for its specific implementation. While matters like national defense, which require nationwide coordination, must be handled by the central government. The third is the incentive principle. To motivate those who act and hold them accountable. Localities that perform well receive recognition for their achievements and preferential resources. Those that perform poorly bear the corresponding consequences. This incentive mechanism gives local governments a strong motivation to optimize the efficiency of their responsibilities. The first step in economic development is attracting projects. Investment promotion is not simply a matter of shouting slogans, but a systematic endeavor where local governments mobilize all resources. First, local governments offer to market operators. Industrial land is like a booth for investment promotion. Not only is it offered at a low price but sometimes even for free. And it comes with 7 connections and 1 leveling, including electricity, roads, heating, etc. It's like a shopping mall renovating the space for its tenants. Second, comprehensive support is provided. In addition to land, tax incentives are offered, such as 3 years free, 3 years half price, and financial support. For example, coordinating bank loans and providing administrative convenience, such as assisting with approval procedures. Even solving issues like children's enrollment for employees' families, and medical care for family members. In essence, this is trading resources for development. Local governments sacrifice short-term land revenue and taxes to gain long-term tax revenue, employment, and industrial cluster development after the enterprises. Land. For example, Suzhou Industrial Park, through investment promotion, developed from a piece of farmland into an industrial powerhouse with a GDP exceeding 270 billion yuan. Doing things costs money. The core challenge for local governments in economic development is, where does the money come from? The 1994 tax sharing reform completely rewrote the logic of local revenue sources, giving rise to the dual-wheel drive model of finance, taxation, and land. Before the tax sharing system, local areas implemented a fiscal contract system. After paying the central government, the rest was theirs. While this model stimulated local initiative, it led to a continuous decline in the central government's share of fiscal revenue. The two ratios, that is the proportion of central fiscal revenue to national fiscal revenue, and the proportion of national fiscal revenue to GDP, continuously declined, weakening the central government's ability to regulate. The core change of the tax sharing system is to divide taxes into central taxes, local taxes, and shared taxes. Among them, the most crucial value-added tax. The central government takes 75% and the local government keeps 25%. At the same time, 2 separate tax agencies were established, national and local, to prevent local interference in tax collection. The direct impact on local governments is a significant reduction in local budget revenue but no reduction in responsibilities. They still need to undertake construction, attract investment, and provide public services. We still need to focus on construction, attract investment, and provide public services. The revenue expenditure gap can only be filled by tax rebates and transfer payments, but this portion of funds is limited and inflexible. To bridge the gap, Local governments must seek off-budget revenue. Land finance emerged to meet this need. Land finance is not simply about selling land for profit, but a sophisticated logic of generating wealth from land. First is the arbitrage in land transfer fees. Industrial land is sold at low prices, even at a loss. To attract businesses, commercial and residential land is auctioned at high prices, generating substantial profits. For example, in 2018, the average transaction price for industrial land was only 820 yuan per square meter, while residential land prices were 7.4 times higher, and commercial land prices were 4.6 times higher. The revenue from commercial and residential land perfectly subsidized the cost of industrial land and infrastructure development. Second is the dual value of land. It can not only be sold directly for cash, i.e. land transfer revenue, but also be capitalized. Land use rights can be mortgaged to banks to obtain loans, which is land finance. For instance, local governments establish urban investment companies and use their land reserves as collateral to leverage massive funds for construction. How vast is this scale? In 2018, land transfer revenue alone reached 6.29 trillion yuan, coupled with land-related taxes, including land value-added tax and deed tax. Total land finance revenue accounted for 89% of local public budget revenue, making it the de facto second fiscal pillar. After the tax-sharing reform, local revenue expenditure gaps are filled by central transfer payments. However, this balance faces issues in both vertical and horizontal dimensions. First is vertical imbalance. Fiscal powers are increasingly centralized upwards, while administrative powers are pushed downwards. Provincial governments receive substantial transfer payments, while county and township levels suffer from weak fiscal capacity. Many counties and townships in the central and western regions once faced eating finance, where revenue was barely enough to cover staff salaries, leaving no funds for construction. This was the backdrop for later reforms, like township finance managed by county, provincial oversight of county. Second is horizontal imbalance. Eastern coastal regions, with their land finance and corporate taxes, enjoy ample fiscal resources. In contrast, central and western regions have low land values and fewer businesses relying solely on central transfer payments. In 2018, 85% of central transfer payments flowed to the central and western regions. Yet even so, the per capita fiscal expenditure gap at the county level remains significant. The top 1% of counties have 19 times the per capita expenditure of the bottom 1%. With revenue secured, local governments must spend wisely, investing in infrastructure, industrial parks, and supporting businesses. However, these investments are large in scale and long in duration. Fiscal revenue alone is far from sufficient. Thus, financing platforms and debt became the core tools, driving economic growth while harboring hidden risks. Legally, local governments cannot borrow directly from banks or issue bonds arbitrarily. Hence, local government financing platforms, or LGFPs, emerged. Essentially, they are the government's purse personified. LGFPs are wholly state-owned enterprises controlled and funded by local governments, holding substantial land assets injected by the government. Leveraging these assets through mortgages or government credit guarantees, they secure loans from banks or issue LGFB bonds. Here are some typical examples: Chengdu Culture and Tourism Group, Suzhou Industrial Park Jiao Run Group. Taking Chengdu Culture and Tourism Group as an example, upon its establishment in 2007, its registered capital was only 500 million yuan. It leveraged bank loans by mortgaging land assets injected by the government. By 2018, its assets had reached 20.4 billion yuan. It not only developed Quanzhai Alley but also spurred prosperity in surrounding commercial areas. The operational logic is that the core of LGFPs is not profit, but to help the government finance construction. Their profits largely depend on government subsidies, such as tax rebates and land transfer fee reimbursements. For example, Chengdu Culture and Tourism received the Chengdu Tourism Industry Support Fund, with subsidies of over 100 million yuan annually. Local governments borrowed money through urban investment companies, accumulating massive debt over time. However, the risk is not in the total amount but in structural imbalance. First, let's discuss debt composition. Explicit and implicit debt. Implicit debt is the core risk. Many urban investment company projects such as industrial parks in remote areas, have extremely low returns, making it impossible to repay the principal, so they can only rely on borrowing to pay off old debts. Secondly, the risk is concentrated locally. Vertically speaking, county and township level government debt burdens are far heavier than provincial levels. Horizontally speaking, central and western regions are far heavier than eastern regions. The debt in these areas is mostly invested in projects with poor returns. Once land transfer revenue declines, the pressure to repay debt will increase sharply. But this is not an unsolvable problem. The solution is not to deleverage across the board, but to close the back door and open the front door. Strictly control the increase of implicit debt and allow provincial governments to issue bonds. Replace high-interest debt with low-interest debt while requiring projects to have actual returns to avoid blind investment. The formation of local debt is inseparable from officials' incentive mechanisms, such as term pressure. Local chief officials have an average term of only 3 to 4 years. To achieve political achievements in a short period, they will inevitably tend to undertake large projects and large investments. These projects can quickly boost GDP, but their long-term returns and debt risks are often overlooked. For example, the direction of reform. The lifelong accountability system promoted in recent years, which does not judge heroes by GDP, is intended to force officials to balance short-term achievements with long-term risks. For example, including debt control and ecological protection indicators in performance evaluations. To reduce the impulse for short-sighted investment, investment attraction is only the first step. Getting companies to stay, grow and become strong is the key to local governments. Sustainable economic development. Local governments are not just investment recruiters, but also industrial investors and growth companions. Through direct investment subsidies and industrial funds, they promote industrial upgrading. The core of local government support for industries lies in two paths, each with its own advantages and disadvantages, but both meeting the development needs of different stages. One is the Bo model, where the government directly invests. When Bo was building its 6th generation line in Hefei, the Hefei government promised to invest 6 billion yuan, and was even willing to inject 9 billion yuan through private placement and coordinated syndicated loans of 7.5 billion yuan. The core of this model is the government bears the risk and the company handles the technology. At that time, LCD panels were monopolized by Japan and South Korea, and private enterprises dared not invest in building production lines. The government stepped in, not only helping Bo weather the industry cycle, but also driving the agglomeration of upstream and downstream industries, making Hefei a high ground for optoelectric display industry. The other is the photovoltaic model, which is subsidies plus market competition. In the early stages, the photovoltaic industry was 3 external, meaning that the market technology and raw materials all relied on overseas sources. Local governments provided land use loan subsidies and price subsidies to attract companies to settle. Subsidies are not to support the lazy, but are a stepping stone. With subsidy support, photovoltaic companies rapidly expanded production and achieved economies of scale. Costs continued to decline, and they eventually moved from relying on subsidies to grid parity. Currently, China's photovoltaic module production accounts for 80% of the global total. As the market matures, local governments' support methods have shifted from direct cash injections to market-oriented operations, and industrial guidance funds have emerged. The operating logic is as follows. The government acts as the LP, i.e. the investor, and professional investment institutions act as the GP, i.e. the manager. They establish industrial funds to invest in local key industry enterprises. The government does not interfere with specific investment decisions, but only requires funds to be invested in specific areas, such as chips and new energy. This has both advantages and risks. The advantage is that it can leverage social capital and disperse risks. 100 million yuan of government funds can drive 300 to 400 million yuan of social capital. The risk is to prevent private equity disguised as debt. Some funds appear to be equity investments but actually have fixed return agreements. At its core, it's still implicit government debt violating market principles. Local governments supporting industries isn't overstepping boundaries. It's about filling market gaps. One is filling the risk gap. High investment, long cycle, high-tech industries like chips and display panels, private enterprises dare not invest. Government intervention can break the bottleneck. The other is filling the supporting infrastructure gap. Enterprises need an industrial ecosystem to land, roads, energy, and other support. Governments building this infrastructure in advance can lower the cost for enterprises to land. However, the government doesn't make market decisions. The government only provides basic conditions. Whether an enterprise survives ultimately depends on market competition. For example, in the early days of the photovoltaic industry, there were thousands of companies. After market consolidation, leading companies emerged. Outdated capacity was eliminated. These micro-level operations. Local governments offer land at low prices to attract investment, relying on land finance and debt to build and targeted industrial support. These seem like localized actions, one city at a time, but they accumulate nationwide, forming the macroeconomic phenomenon we will discuss next. Understanding the micro-level mechanisms described above, then looking at the macro-level phenomena in the next part, will not seem abrupt. These macroeconomic issues are essentially the scaled-up effects of micro-level operational models. Next, we will start from these micro-level behaviors. Deconstruct urbanization, debt, internal-external imbalances, and other. The core logic of macroeconomic phenomena. Earlier we deconstructed the micro-level mechanisms of local governments profiting from the economy, starting with the tax-sharing system relying on land finance to build, financing platforms incurring debt, and industrial support paving the way, forming an operational model that emphasizes land investment and production. These seemingly localized operations, one city at a time, continuously accumulate and intertwine nationwide, ultimately giving rise to urbanization imbalances, high debt, and three major macroeconomic trends: internal-external imbalances. The core logic of the next part is macroeconomic phenomena are never isolated, but are the scaled-up effects of micro-level mechanisms. Local government land operations determine the direction of urbanization. Debt accumulation leads to systemic debt risks. The emphasis on investment over consumption shapes the internal and external economic structure. Understanding the micro-level logic of finance, land, and debt can reveal the essence of macroeconomic phenomena, and also understand the deep logic of current reforms. The previous part mentioned that one of the core operations of local governments is land finance, offering industrial land at low prices to attract investment, and commercial and residential land at high prices to supplement revenue. This micro-level operation directly pushes urbanization towards a track that prioritizes land over people, ultimately leading to the macroeconomic outcomes of high housing prices, heavy household debt, and widening urban-rural disparities. The ice and fire of housing prices in different cities, a shortage in first-tier cities, inventory backlog in third and fourth-tier cities. This is essentially a macroeconomic projection of local government land supply logic. From the supply side, local government land sale strategies have a natural structural bias. First, industrial land is sold at a loss to gain profit. To attract investment, local governments price industrial land below cost, even offering it at zero land price. In 2018, the average transaction price of industrial land was only 7.4% of that of residential land. This subsidized land supply occupies a large amount of construction land quotas, directly squeezing the supply of commercial and residential land. Second, construction land quotas are like a cage. Construction land quotas allocated by the central government cannot flow across regions. Eastern coastal areas with continuous population inflow lack land, while central and western regions with continuous population outflow have idle quotas. From 2003 to 2014, land supply in the central and western regions increased from less than 30% to 60%, but population still flocked to the east. The mismatch between supply and demand is becoming more severe. Third, commercial and residential land is subject to artificial scarcity. To maximize land sale revenue, local governments deliberately control the pace of commercial and residential land sales, even creating land auctions to drive up land prices. From 2000 to 2020, the average price of commercial housing nationwide increased by 4.2 times. The increase in first-tier cities exceeded 10 times. Demand-side analysis reveals growth far exceeding resident income. The inverse relationship between population mobility and land supply exacerbated the conflict. The concentration of population in large cities is an economic law. Population share in the Yangtze River Delta and Pearl River Delta from 2000 to 2020 increased from 22% to 28%. However, the growth rate of residential land supply in these areas was only 70% of the national average. The household registration system further amplified demand pressure with a large number of permanent residents unable to obtain hukou, forcing them to compete for limited commercial housing quotas under purchase restrictions, driving up demand from both first-time buyers and investors. High housing prices directly plunged families into a debt spiral, creating a macroeconomic chain from housing prices to hidden debt to consumption squeeze. Looking at the debt structure, resident debt is highly concentrated in mortgages. As of the end of 2018, 53% of resident debt was housing loans, including consumer loans implicitly used for buying homes. Debt related to real estate accounted for over 70%. The debt burden continued to increase. In 2019, the debt-to-income ratio for urban residents reached 1.6, approaching the level before the U.S. financial crisis. For low-income families, the debt-to-income ratio was as high as 3, exceeding reasonable affordability. From a macroeconomic perspective, resident debt has created a dual squeeze on the economy. On one hand, it squeezes consumption capacity. From 2010 to 2020, the proportion of resident consumption to GDP only increased from 35% to 44%, far below the level of around 70% in developed countries. Monthly mortgage payments have become a fixed expenditure for many families, squeezing consumption on education, healthcare, and entertainment. On the other hand, it widens the wealth gap. Homeowners achieved wealth appreciation through rising housing prices, while those without homes faced difficulties in entering the market. In 2019, the richest 10% of households owned 49% of resident wealth, with real estate accounting for over 60%. While the poorest 40% of households owned only 8% of the wealth. The operational model of local governments relying on land revenue has led to an inflated characteristic of urbanization. The built-up area of cities expanded from 22,000 square kilometers in 2000 to 61,000 square kilometers in 2020, an increase of 177%. However, the urbanization rate based on hukou population only rose from 34% to 45%, far below the permanent resident urbanization rate of 64%. This imbalance has led to two major macroeconomic problems. One is the inequality in urban-rural public services. Education and healthcare resources are allocated based on hukou population. Over 200 million migrant workers and their families cannot equally enjoy public services. Left behind children and elderly have become social pain points. The other is the inefficiency of cities. Many third and fourth tier cities have blindly expanded, building a large number of vacant industrial parks and commercial housing. In 2020, the vacancy rate of commercial housing nationwide exceeded 15%. While core areas of first-tier cities face land shortages, the core direction of reform for inefficient resource allocation is precisely to correct these micro-operational deviations. For example, land reform allowing collective construction land to enter the market, and cross-regional trading of construction land quotas to allow land supply to keep pace with population mobility. For example, hukou reform, lifting household registration restrictions except for megacities, and linking public services to permanent residents to make urbanization truly people-oriented. As mentioned in the previous section, local governments borrowed through financing platforms. Enterprises, especially state-owned enterprises, increased leverage. Residents took out mortgages to buy homes, forming a debt chain of government, enterprises, and residents. These micro-level borrowing behaviors accumulated into systemic debt risks at the macroeconomic level, becoming a significant constraint on economic growth. The debt risk is not a problem of a single entity, but a structural risk intertwined among three types of entities. The root cause of all of them points to the micro-operational model of local governments. First, local government debt with hidden debt as the core risk. Let's first discuss the micro causes. After the tax-sharing system, fiscal power was centralized, while expenditure responsibilities were decentralized. Local governments could only borrow through financing platforms to undertake construction. After the 4 trillion yuan stimulus plan in 2008, the number of financing platforms surged from over 3,000 to over 8,000. Let's look at the macro characteristics. Imbalanced debt structure. Hidden debt accounts for over 60%. County and township governments and central and western regions bear the heaviest debt burden. In 2018, The average debt ratio of county-level governments in the central and western regions reached 130%, far exceeding the warning line. The fundamental risk here is not excessive total debt, but a mismatch between project returns and debt. Many infrastructure projects have returns of less than 1%, far below financing costs, forcing them to rely on rolling over old debts with new ones. Second, corporate debt. State-owned enterprises and financing platforms are the main players. Let's start with micro-level causes. Local governments to attract investment, encourage corporate expansion through methods like subsidized loans and land incentives. State-owned enterprises and financing platforms directly undertake government investment projects. In 2018, corporate debt accounted for 154% of GDP, far higher than the average level in developed countries. Looking at macro characteristics, debt is concentrated in inefficient sectors. The average asset-liability ratio of state-owned enterprises is 65%, while their net return on equity is only half that of private enterprises. A large number of zombie enterprises occupy credit resources, exacerbating overcapacity. Here's a transmission path. Corporate debt defaults can transmit to banks. In 2018, the non-performing loan ratio for corporate loans rose to 1.89%, with non-performing rates in industries with concentrated overcapacity exceeding 3%. Third, household debt. Mortgages are the main driver. The micro-level cause is high housing prices forcing families to buy homes through mortgages. From 2010 to 2020, the balance of individual housing loans increased from 5.7 trillion yuan to 34.1 trillion yuan, a 4.9-fold increase. The macro risk is the deep entanglement of household debt with real estate. Once housing prices fall, it could trigger a debt housing price vicious cycle. The lesson from the 2008 U.S. subprime crisis is precisely this. Although the non-performing loan ratio for Chinese household mortgages is only 0.3%, hidden risks cannot be ignored. These three types of debt are interconnected, forming a debt transmission chain. The first chain, due to government debt pressure, livelihood expenditures are squeezed. Local governments, to repay debt, may cut livelihood expenditures such as education and healthcare, further suppressing consumption. The second chain, due to high corporate debt, investment vitality is suppressed. A large amount of credit is occupied by inefficient enterprises, making it difficult and expensive for private enterprises to finance. In 2018, the financing cost for private enterprises was 1.5 percentage points higher than for state-owned enterprises. The third chain, due to heavy household debt, consumption remains weak. Monthly mortgage payments squeeze disposable income. In 2019, household consumption's contribution to GDP growth was only 3.5 percentage points, far lower than investment and exports. Macro-level debt resolution is essentially correcting the logic of borrowing at the micro level. First, close the back door. Strictly control new hidden debt and standardize the operation of financing platforms. The new regulations in 2018 cut off the channel for shadow banking to channel funds to financing platforms. Second, open the front door. Allow provincial governments to issue bonds, using low-interest government bonds to replace high-interest hidden debt. From 2015 to 2019, over 12 trillion yuan of debt was cumulatively replaced. Third, strengthen accountability. Establish a lifelong accountability system for officials' debt. Change the incentive mechanism that prioritizes investment over risk. After the issuance of measures for accountability on local government hidden debt in 2018, officials in many regions were held accountable for illegal borrowing. Fourth, improve efficiency. Promote mixed ownership reform of state-owned enterprises, allowing credit resources to flow to efficient sectors. From 2016 to 2020, over 150 million tons of excess capacity were cumulatively resolved, significantly improving market efficiency. As mentioned in the first part, local governments prioritize investment over consumption. Enterprises rely on exports to digest capacity, and household income share is low. These micro-level structural deviations have led to insufficient domestic consumption and international overcapacity at the macro level, creating an internal-external imbalance, ultimately triggering trade conflicts and giving rise to the new development pattern of dual circulation. The core of the domestic imbalance is income distribution tilted towards government and enterprises, insufficient resident consumption capacity, This is directly related to the micro operations of local governments. From the perspective of income distribution, the proportion of resident income has been continuously low. The micro cause is after the tax sharing system. The government, through land finance and tax sharing, took away part of the fruits of economic growth. From 2000 to 2010, the proportion of disposable income of residents to GDP decreased from 70% to 60%, while the income share of enterprises and government increased accordingly. The macro result is reflected in the proportion of consumption to GDP. Long-term below 50%, far below the level of developed countries. In 2018, China's resident consumption rate was only 44%, while the United States was 68% and Germany was 53%. From the perspective of the relationship between investment and consumption, excessive investment squeezed consumption. The micro cause is that local governments, in pursuit of GDP growth, are keen on infrastructure and industrial projects. From 2000 to 2018, the proportion of investment to GDP increased from 35% to 44%, among which the proportion of infrastructure investment increased from 14% to 21%. The macro result is reflected in the prominent problem of overcapacity. In 2018, the capacity utilization rates in industries such as steel, cement, and photovoltaics were only 70% to 80%. A large amount of resources were wasted, and the pulling effect of consumption on the economy has always been insufficient. Insufficient domestic consumption leads to the export of capacity, forming an export-oriented model of large imports and large exports, ultimately leading to international imbalances and trade conflicts. From the perspective of export scale, the rapid expansion of manufacturing exports impacted the global division of labor. The micro foundation is the land preferential policies of local governments. Tax subsidies reduce the production costs of enterprises. The proportion of China's manufacturing value added in the world increased from 5% in 2000 to 28% in 2019, becoming the world's factory. The macro impact is the proportion of exports to GDP reached a peak of 35% in 2006. The export of a large amount of capacity caused trade friction. In 2018, the Sino-US trade friction escalated. The total amount of tariffs imposed by the United States on Chinese goods exceeded $200 billion. From the perspective of trade structure, value chain upgrading exacerbated the conflict. The micro change is that China's exports shifted from processing imported materials to independent manufacturing. In 2005, among export products, the value share of imported components from overseas was 26%. It dropped to 17% in 2015, with continuously increasing independent technological content. The macro conflict is China's breakthroughs in high-end manufacturing, such as photovoltaics, new energy vehicles, and high-end equipment, impacted the traditional advantageous industries of developed countries. Trade conflicts shifted from quantity disputes to technology disputes, with the domestic cycle as the mainstay, and the domestic and international dual cycles promoting each other as a strategy, is essentially to correct past micro-operation deviations and solve the problems of internal and external imbalances. The core of the domestic cycle is to expand domestic demand and smooth the circulation. First, increase resident income through market-oriented reform of factor allocation. For example, household registration and land to increase residents' property income. In 2020, the opinions on building a more perfect system and mechanism for market-oriented allocation of factors clearly stated. Promote the free flow of factors such as land and labor. Second, improve public services and increase expenditure on education, healthcare, and elderly care. Reduce the resident savings rate. From 2010 to 2020, the proportion of government spending on people's livelihood increased from 26% to 40%. Third, smooth the industrial chain and break local protectionism. Build a unified national market and allow resources to flow freely between regions. Resolve overcapacity. The core of the international dual cycle is high-end docking and open cooperation. On the one hand, technological upgrading to get rid of dependence on overseas core technologies. Local governments, through industrial funds, support high-end industries such as chips and biomedicine. From 2014 to 2020, the scale of government industrial guidance funds increased from less than 100 billion yuan to 4 trillion yuan. On the other hand, expand imports and reduce tariffs, optimizing the business environment. making the domestic market a hub for global resource allocation. From 2018 to 2020, total domestic imports increased from $2.1 trillion to $2.2 trillion. Market attractiveness continues to improve. 3 macro phenomena in the next part. Urbanization imbalance, debt risk, internal and external imbalance. Tracing the root cause. All are the inevitable results of the micro mechanisms in the previous part. Local governments prioritize land over people, leading to superficial urbanization and a tendency to incur debt without considering efficiency. Accumulating debt risk and a bias towards investment over consumption, causing internal and external imbalance. These macro issues are not solely the result of excessive government intervention or market failure, but rather the product of micro-operational models that are mismatched with the stage of economic development. During the long-term coexistence of government and market, in the past, this set of micro-mechanisms helped our country rapidly advance industrialization and urbanization, creating economic growth miracles. Now, as the economy enters a stage of high-quality development, it is necessary to reconstruct the relationship between government and market, shifting from a production-oriented government to a service-oriented government, shifting from land-driven to innovation-driven, shifting from export-oriented to balanced internal and external development. Understanding this, we can then look at the current reforms. Land transfer and household registration liberalization are aimed at correcting urbanization imbalance. Debt swaps and new asset management regulations are intended to resolve debt risks. Factor marketization and dual circulation are aimed at breaking internal and external imbalances. The core of these reforms is to make the interaction between government and market more adaptable to the stage of economic development. This is also the core of the summary in the next part. To understand Dongda economics, the key is to understand the symbiotic logic of government and market. The core secret to understanding Dongda economics lies not in dwelling on the binary opposition of government vs market, but in recognizing their deep symbiosis and dynamic adaptation. The government has never been an outsider, but is a core element deeply embedded in the economic cycle, acting as both a rule maker and an environment shaper, as well as a resource allocator and industry promoter. This symbiotic model of government and market has supported past growth miracles and also dictates the direction of current reforms. The uniqueness of Dongda economics lies in the fact that the government is not a bystander to the market, but has formed a symbiotic relationship with the market, with aligned goals and complementary means. This relationship was not deliberately designed, but originated from historical choices and adaptation to the stage of development. In the early stages of reform and opening up, with a blank market mechanism and a lack of credit system, local governments took the initiative to cultivate the market, resolving infrastructure funding through land finance, addressing enterprise financing difficulties through financing platforms, breaking through technological blockades through industrial support, rapidly building the basic framework for industrialization and urbanization. After the market matured, the government did not withdraw, but shifted to optimizing rules, standardizing land auctions to resolve hidden debts, promoting factor marketization, allowing the market to play a decisive role in resource allocation, while maintaining a bottom line for risk control. The symbiosis between the two is not the government replacing the market, but the government filling the market's shortcomings. For infrastructure and high-tech industries requiring high investment and long cycles, private enterprises are hesitant to invest or find them unprofitable. The government takes the lead in breakthroughs and then hands them over to market competition for optimization. Bose technological breakthroughs and the iterative upgrading of the photovoltaic industry are typical examples of this model. The key to this symbiotic model is goal synergy. The economic growth pursued by the government, employment stability, and the efficiency improvement and profit growth sought by the market were highly aligned in the early stages of development. As the development stage changes and the adaptability needs to be adjusted, the core of reform is to recalibrate this symbiotic relationship. The symbiotic model of government and market has not only created growth miracles that have attracted global attention, but has also accumulated phase-deep challenges. The two are essentially two sides of the same logic. Growth dividends come from concentrating efforts to accomplish major tasks. The government through the linkage of fiscal tax, land, and financial tools. The government links fiscal tax, land, and financial tools, rapidly mobilize massive resources to promote industrialization and urbanization. achieve in decades what developed countries took centuries to accomplish. From 2000 to 2020, China's manufacturing value added as a percentage of the global total rose from 5% to 28%, and its urbanization rate increased from 36% to 64%. Behind this lies the support of this model. Stage challenges stem from model inertia. Local governments have long relied on land finance and investment-driven growth, leading to three imbalances: urbanization prioritizing land over people, driving up housing prices and household debt, the economy prioritizing investment over consumption, exacerbating internal and external imbalances, and industries prioritizing scale over efficiency, accumulating debt risks. These problems are not inherent to the symbiotic model, but are the result of the model failing to adapt in time. As development stages changed, understanding this allows us to move beyond simplistic judgments of excessive government intervention or insufficient market freedom. Past success was a dividend from the adaptability of government and market. The current reforms are about aligning this symbiotic relationship with the new demands of high-quality development. The core of calibrating the symbiotic relationship is the transformation of the government's role from a production-oriented government directly involved in production and investment, to a service-oriented government that maintains fair competition and provides public services. This is also the underlying logic of all current reforms. Factor market reforms breaking household registration restrictions, allowing free population mobility and liberalizing land transfer, enable resources to adapt to demand. Essentially, it's about letting the market lead factor allocation. The government will no longer distort resource flows through administrative means. Fiscal and debt reforms promoting property taxes, optimizing transfer payments and breaking reliance on land finance. Through debt swaps and lifelong accountability, resolve hidden debt risks. This aligns government fiscal capacity with its responsibilities, so it no longer relies on borrowing for short-term investments. Industrial policy transformation shifting from direct subsidies and administrative intervention to market-oriented industrial funds and a fair business environment, allowing enterprises to compete on technology and efficiency. The government focuses on basic research and public technology platform construction. People's livelihood orientation upgrade. Increase spending on education, healthcare, and elder care. Reduce household savings rates and expand consumption. Shift economic growth from investment-driven to consumption and innovation-driven. Address the shortcomings of past production-focused policies that neglected people's livelihoods. This transformation is not about weakening the government, but about the government finding its proper place in the symbiotic relationship. Instead of competing with the market for profit, it safeguards the market. Instead of interfering with micro decisions, it supports the macro bottom line. Mastering the core code of government-market symbiosis will allow us to understand the series of current reform measures. Why emphasize common prosperity? Because the past growth model resulted in excessively high returns from capital and land, with a low proportion of labor income. This needs to be adjusted through taxation. Equalize public services to make the dividends of the symbiotic model more equitable. Why adhere to housing is for living, not speculation. Because housing prices are tied to land finance, over-leveraging household consumption capacity and distorting resource allocation. We need to strip real estate of its financial attributes and let housing return to its essence as a livelihood. Why promote dual circulation? Because prioritizing investment over consumption led to insufficient domestic markets and over-reliance on exports. We need to expand domestic demand and achieve technological self-reliance to shift the symbiotic model from external dependence to internal-external balance. Ultimately, every breakthrough in the economy is an optimization of the government-market symbiotic relationship. Every transformation is a precise adaptation to the stage of development. There is no single optimal model that fits all circumstances. Only continuously adjusted adaptive models exist. Alright, we've interpreted this book up to this point. I hope it has been insightful for you. Finally, as always, congratulations on finishing another book.